Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology on a Tuesday, joined by Dr. Paul Thigpen, a returning guest on the show. I had him on last time to talk about his book, Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Catholic Faith. And this time we're going to talk a little bit more about the book, but also the congressional hearings that were recently conducted on the topic of UFOs, or I think now they go by UAPs. But welcome back to the show, Dr. Thigpen. How are you?
Great to be here, Michael. Thanks for the invitation, buddy.
Yeah, really excited about this. As I was telling you before the show, I heard about the congressional hearings and I immediately thought I need to get Dr. Paul on the show to weigh in on this. So here we are. Can you maybe talk to us? I suppose before we dive into the congressional hearings, first tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this topic.
Yeah, it's been an interest of mine since my youth. Back before I was a Christian believer, I was an atheist as a teenager, but then after I became Christian, and then 30 years ago, I became Catholic Christian. And it's always been something I've had some interest in. I especially wondering how, if at all, could converge with Catholic faith or be accommodated by Catholic faith if there was such a thing as extraterrestrial intelligent life. And did research over the years, but then back in 2019, when the New York Times ran the second piece of a very important story about how behind the scenes the U.S. government had a program studying UFOs, had for years, even though they had denied it, and that and one of the things that really caught my attention was they talked about a slide that was shown in a closed congressional hearing, a classified hearing, in which Eric Davis, we'll go into talking about him, but anyway, somebody would know what he's talking about, was talking about the retrieval of crashed UFOs. And I thought, my goodness, if that's true, that puts everything in a whole new category, because you're not just talking about apparitions or lights in the sky, but he's talking about actual craft that have been recovered. And so that got me thinking, I've got to write about this. I really do. A book I wanted to write for many years. So started work on it then. And then last November, published a book called Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Catholic Faith. Are we alone in the universe with God and the angels? And since then, the thing we're talking about today, congressional hearings, but so much more has been happening. So it looks like a good time to be thinking about those things.
Oh, very much so. And so I watched the congressional hearings. Are there going to be more by any chance? Do you know?
I'm pretty confident. Senate hearings and perhaps more in the House as well. Some have said by the end of September. I don't know if it'll happen that quickly or not. Wow. But seems like all the folks the journalists that I trust to have really good contacts are saying for sure there will be more.
So tell us specifically about this hearing. What was the focus? What were they trying to get to?
There's a particular man who had been a pretty high-ranking officer in the intelligence community. His name was David Grusch. I could give all kinds of details about his credentials, but highly credentialed, top secret clearance, decorated vet from Afghanistan, had been with federal agencies that sent him as a representative to the now public group that the U.S. government has for studying UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. It's kind of a broader term than UFO. And anyway, he had appeared first in an interview that was published in a online paper called The Debrief, in which he made some pretty startling claims to a lot of folks. And then that was followed up just a few days later by an interview with Ross Coulthard, he's an investigative journalist from Australia, has won a number of awards there, who's been studying this for some years himself. He set out to debunk it and then became convinced that this stuff is true. Wrote a book called In Plain Sight, which I really recommend. Ross did the interview with him. And so there's even more in the interview than there was in the article that was published. And then as a result of those folks and some others working with congressional representatives, both in the House and the Senate, the House decided to have an interview with him, a hearing. So there have been a couple of briefings before, but they weren't really like this. And so they They called him as a witness, and then two Navy pilots, former Navy pilots, Commander Dave Fravor and Lieutenant Ryan Graves, both of whom highly respected, credentialed folks who had witnessed things themselves in the sky. So those were the three witnesses. They were called. The hearing was on July 26th. But that's kind of how it came about. And the most, for those of us who studied the subject, there wasn't much said there that was new to us. But for a lot of folks who haven't studied it, a lot of things. But some of the things that, some of the claims that Grusch was making, such as that, yes, the government, federal government, Department of Defense, in cooperation with the intelligence community, does have recovered craft material of non-human origin, almost certainly turned over to private aerospace industry for study and reverse engineering. That kind of stuff has been was published 36 years ago at least by investigative journalist George Knapp, who's still on that study. So I'm just saying, for a lot of us, these claims have been out there a long time. What was different this time was that you had a man of impeccable credentials, highly placed in the intelligence community, associated with the agencies that would have known this, claiming that under oath before Congress, that his investigations into this subject, in the course of that, more than 40 witnesses came to him and said, yes, there are such programs. I have hands-on work with them. I know them from firsthand, and they are not being covered by congressional oversight the way they're legally required to do. So these are some of these black programs, they're called, that folks don't know about. They're kept secret, that even Congress was being kept secret from them. So that was illegal. Admit that all kinds of things could be happening that don't have the needed oversight, and even claim that there were, white collar crimes with the funding, with the contracts done, and other kinds of things. He had, by the time he made the interview with Congress, he had already gone through the proper procedures of filing a report with the general inspector of the intelligence community, saying, this is what I've found. It needs to be looked into. And by the way, contrary to the law, there's been retribution against me, retaliation for seeking to do this. So he brought that to them. The inspector general then found that information, as they put it, to be credible and urgent, and then brought it to the Congress. And as it turns out, in the case of the congressional committees and others have been involved, Grusch has actually behind the scenes been giving testimony to them for some time. And so for most of them, it wasn't new stuff, but what was new was that it's public this time.
I forget who they quoted, but there was a lady at the congressional hearing who quoted somebody saying to the effect that there really has been no evidence of a crash retrieval program or a reverse engineering program, and it was allegedly from somebody who should be in the know. Do you recall that part from the hearing?
Probably Susan Goff, who's kind of the
sounds right.
Yeah, the person with the DOD who's kind of the person who answers requests and questions like that. And and it was very carefully worded, just as other claims have been worded, that the particular office, Arrow, which is the one that's supposedly designated by the Department of Defense to be investigating these things, that they have not received any credible evidence and that kind of thing. So first problem with that is that, that agency may not be given a whole lot of evidence that's out there that Grusch, this whistleblower, had access to. So she could be telling the truth that that particular, because she didn't say the Department of Defense or the federal government has none of this, just that very narrow, recently formed agency. But at the same time, Grusch, the whistleblower, said that he had contacted the head of that group with information and said, wanted him to call him, and that he never did. So that those kinds of claims, which Kirkpatrick also made, the head of that group, made have certainly been called into question.
There was something during the congressional hearings where they were talking about this cover-up, and they were saying that it could be the case that funds that are allocated to some governmental programs they're kind of overcharging and then shifting some of those funds elsewhere to these illicit programs. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, that's part of what Congress is really digging into. You've got, folks in that committee who are also responsible for looking into that kind of thing. And the defense budget has been failing its audit for years, with all kinds of money unaccounted for, apparently. And so what Grusch was suggesting was that there's evidence that in order to kind of cover over this, that the aerospace industry folks who had the recovered material were overcharging for what they were doing, and then that money coming back to them was used for the research, which would be illegal, I think. And other things too, that I don't know how much he went into in detail in the hearing, but also there's a very clear federal law about having, when you take bids from different companies, that there has to be competition and that kind of thing, no favoritism. And one of the claims is that what the DoD has done is to kind of designate a particular group for this research and give them the material, whatever the recovery material is, and then to come back and award them the contract, so that there's been favoritism shown. So you have things like that. More serious claims too, of course. Grusch saying that the people are being retaliated against, that witnesses are being intimidated. He feared for his life and the life of his family. That's not the first time we've heard that from witnesses in this situation. And that's pretty serious stuff.
Who would have the power to cover this kind of stuff up, especially from people in Congress who are saying, well, I'm not aware of this. Who would have that ability to cover this kind of stuff up in the government?
Well, you go back to Senator Harry Reid, who was one of the ones that established a program, one of the black programs, called black because it means that it's kind of blacked out from view of the Congress, that is nevertheless still supposed to be, certain members of Congress are supposed to have access. But especially once, if this is true, if these materials have been handed over to private industry, aerospace industry and others, defense contractors, then it really is out of sight. It really is out of sight in the government. And especially if you got the situation where literally billions of dollars are not accounted for in the budget, the DoD budget, under the audit. You got big questions about where's that money going, but we don't even know where it's going. Who would have the power? Well, the folks that are directly involved with it. And what they have had is the power of secrecy. That's a great power.
Wow. Do you think that this is going to put an end to it, the congressional hearing?
Not this one hearing. Others might help. But you have all kinds of things going on. I'm not the first to note that in some cases, congressional members who might have been expected to be looking into this, if you look at the public records, their campaigns receive huge amounts of money from the aerospace and defense industry. And we all know that that's how things go in Washington, that people buy influence by their contributions to campaigns. You've got that going on. You've got, there seems to be a kind of a divided response within the DoD, Department of Defense, and the intelligence community, where you've got some folks who really want this to finally come out in the open, for us to have transparency and find out what's the truth. And then you've got others that are pushing back and, doing what they can to obfuscate, to put barriers in the way of people revealing it. So there seems to be a conflict even within the government itself between those two parties.
You know what I noticed over and over? Grusch kept saying, well, I have this information, but I can only reveal it, in a closed setting, in a SCIF. I'm curious, has there been any indication that has since transpired, that he's communicated a lot of this private information in a closed setting? Do you know anything about this?
There's actually evidence that he had already given a lot of it to at least some of the members of Congress. You can see that in David Schumer's proposed amendment to the NDAA Act funding, that the wording was specifically tailored to the kind of stuff that Grusch was talking about, in saying that the government, Congress can pass a law that says that these things must be revealed to us. So, and and you've had, Marco Rubio saying that he had heard classified testimony from folks, and it caused them to say, we've really got to look into this. So a lot of the stuff has already come, not just from Grusch, but a whole lot of other folks, apparently. The problem they're running into is the kind of top secret classification that Grusch has had, and is required to know some of the stuff that not everybody in Congress has that. And so I think they're probably running into some problems with obtaining that kind of classification for some of the people, even in Congress, that need to hear it. So that's part of the problem there. There are powers that be that can make it difficult for those things to happen, for those meetings to happen.
Yeah, but it would be pretty conspicuous at that point that there's a cover up, right? So wouldn't they be tipping their hand when they make it more difficult?
They're doing it now, and you've got a whole country that's almost oblivious to this whole issue. So they've done so much out in the open, and I mean, in plain sight. That's the name of Ross Coulthard's book. Done so much in plain sight, thinking the claim seems so extraordinary, nobody's going to believe it, and nobody's going to pay attention. But more people are paying attention now.
Well, that kind of leads to my next question. If there is this evidence and there's a large group of people that have it and perhaps are in a position to just come out and demonstrate factually that we have recovered alien aircraft or something like that, why not just inform us? Why doesn't the government just come out and say, here it is?
Well, so the government or the whistleblowers?
Well, I suppose those who are in the government, who are in the know and are able to disclose this information.
Gotcha.
Why the secrecy?
Okay.
Why not come out and just tell us?
As opposed to the whistleblowers. Yes, because the whistleblowers, have a whole series of things. They could lose their job, ruin their career, threats against their families and their own health and safety. The folks in the government, but people speculate a lot about this. There's a history to that. It goes back at least to the 1940s with the Roswell event, where the Air Force claimed we have recovered a crashed UFO in Roswell, New Mexico, and then the very next day walked that back and said, "Oh no, it's just a weather balloon," and then changed the story 2 more times after that. So those kinds of things have been going on for a long time, and we now have, from Freedom of Information, released documents that are declassified, internal documents for the DoD and the intelligence community, basically saying this stuff is real. We have got to study it, examine it, but it could cause problems if the public knows that it needs to be covered over. And so the way we're going to do it is to use our, I'll say contacts, but I think some of them may have been paid actually on the payroll for the intelligence community, folks who are in the news media to contribute to a culture of mocking, dismissing this. I'm using my own words, but we have those documents. They're, they haven't been challenged. They can't be challenged. So why would they have done it? Back then, maybe the most reasonable thing would have been, we were at the height of the Cold War. There were concerns that were expressed behind the scenes that, number one, Russia could somehow, our great adversary at the time, could somehow make use of this, that they could, that if everything people saw unusual was in the sky that they thought was UFO, they could send something, missile or something, and people would just say it's a UFO. Or on the other hand, that because we were having several what are called UFO flaps, a lot of people don't realize that in the early 50s, for instance, Washington, D.C. had a whole bunch of these things fly over White House, all over D.C. They were chased by jets. I think they did it 2 weekends in a row. It's in all the papers. It's forgotten today. But things like that were happening. People who would see them would call in and they jam the lines. You didn't have email, you didn't have internet, any of that. And so that was another reason expressed that whenever that happens, people start jamming the lines, there's panic, and then the Russians could use that opportunity. Okay, maybe that's plausible. But once they did it for a while, in order to keep the secret, apparently they did have to commit some crimes. That's what the allegations are anyway. And the more deeply they got entrenched, the harder it was going to be for people to spill the beans, because they would, certain people would be incriminated. And then that's during that period that you begin to get folks saying, when they're, privately, I've been threatened, my family's been threatened, I've been beat up, whatever. You have people who disappeared, who could have been whistleblowers. And it's like a snowball rolling. So, a lot of folks will say, well, look, the government can't keep a secret, blah, 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 like that. Well, yeah, they kept the Manhattan Project a secret, for a while. But the thing is, folks will say, well, there were no leaks or anything. There have been leaks ever since the 40s. There have been people talking about it. But what the government was successful in doing, they couldn't seal all the leaks, was to influence the culture, to dismiss anybody who talked about it, even let alone who witnessed something, to mock them, to make them scorn, to just give them tinfoil hats. And they were able to silence people who did first come out and then silence them afterward. You had a few brave souls who continued to make their stories known. But that's how they did it. They did it by intimidation, by their connections in the press. Again, that they're open about that. There were later investigations of other things that showed that the CIA in particular had folks working in the press to write the stories the way they wanted them.
But why would that continue today? We don't have a Cold War today.
Yeah, exactly. What's been thrown out there is that we don't want our adversaries, if we have this stuff, wouldn't want our adversaries to know what we've got, how good it is, that kind of thing. And that a lot of the evidence, say if you have video evidence or even infrared, that kind of thing, that there's data on the screen and things that would show our capabilities of sensory data collection. And to the second, I would say, well, yeah, that stuff could be scrubbed out of it and it can still be publicized. But the other thing is, folks, we know what an espionage network in our country the Chinese and the Russians both have. I'm convinced they already know what we're doing. They know what we're doing. And the other thing is they have their own. I mean, we know for sure that Russia has for some years had their own program studying that and reversed, the claims are, and I believe them at this point, of recovered materials in Russia. So what would be the point? Today, probably it would be that they are still worried that if they came out with it, that people would panic. There'd be social disruption. I don't think that's nearly as great a problem as it might have been at one time. We've got a generation now raised on Star Wars and other stuff that maybe think in those terms. They also claim that it would again reveal our secrets, but that's doesn't have to be that way. They'll claim. I think there are others who just don't want a further loss of confidence in the federal government, loss of respect, and especially loss of respect for the Department of Defense, because part of what they do, they would not only be admitting, yes, we've lied and done other things in order to keep this from you, right up until now, but they'd also have to admit, we're really not in control of our own airspace, not just the training areas out in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean that have things happening all the time, and they are continuing to happen all the time. But that we don't even, there are all kinds of episodes happening over the continental United States, over Alaska. And I'm not talking about the silly Chinese balloon or anything. Mm-hmm. And so they'd have to admit that they're not in control of our own airspace. That would be a very difficult thing for a Department of Defense, the most powerful country in the world, to have to admit.
So some of these pilots who work for the government, with the Air Force, they have witnessed some of these things, and a few of them came forward, and we'll discuss them in a moment. But why?
Just mention real quick, they were Navy, not Air Force. The Air Force.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
The Air Force has been conspicuously silent on all this, even though they probably have more information than any of the other branches.
Right. Yeah, I guess I haven't thought about that. Yeah, you are. I did note and think it was curious that they were Navy pilots. But okay, parts of the government or, people fly for the government have noticed this. But why is it that we don't see maybe commercial pilots coming forward and say, hey, I saw this whenever, I was flying people to Hawaii or something? I don't know.
Yeah, well, you just got it. I mean, that's some of the most recent ones have been precisely that, but they have the same problem. And that's that now that there has been legislation, passed by Congress saying that you can't have retaliation against anyone working for the government for reporting this stuff. But see, that doesn't apply to private commercial pilots. And you do have people either coming forward anonymously or some of them coming out in the open. And they're saying, yes, we see this stuff. We see it a lot, especially over the Pacific Ocean, people flying like back and forth between Hawaii and our mainland. But there are always threats from the employer saying you will not talk about this or you will lose your job with us, and we'll make sure you don't have a career afterward. That's pretty strong stuff, and good reason for people to keep silent. I mean, that's still going on in the Air Force. They've been the least cooperative, where you have people, pilots testifying. They can't give their names, of course, for that reason, but saying that when I tried reporting stuff, they put me through an 8-hour interrogation process. And most of the guys I know who see it, and they see it all the time, scrub the evidence, erase the videos, whatever that they've got, because they don't want any possibility of it being associated with this, because it probably mean the end of their career.
Wouldn't you have to have a mass conspiracy, though? A massive amount of people who would cover and be willing to cover this up? I mean, you would think that there would be people who are in high positions that would say, no, I'm not going along with this. And so I'm not going to retaliate against this person when they report it.
I'm sure you have some. And that's part of what's going on now. As I said before, there seems to be a number of the investigators and then also former intelligence officials will say, yes, there are some great people, both in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, who say it's time for transparency finally on this issue, who want to see this come out. But they're not necessarily the ones that are the most powerful right now. There is, at the very least, a struggle between the two groups. But yeah, you do have some folks. And even the fact that the Inspector General of the intelligence community, when he received the stuff from David Grusch, he could have shut that down and just right away said it's not credible. But he says credible and urgent. He went to Congress with it. So you've got there a great example of someone high up at the top of the intelligence community saying, yes, something's going on here.
But for commercial pilots, I mean, we're not dealing directly with the intelligence community, I guess, to my knowledge. I mean, we're dealing with the private sector. And so why would there be a motivation to cover things up there? Because
of the stigma still associated with them, that, and this is always suggested, where they're told to shut up, that if you're seeing this kind of thing, that you either have a physical or a mental problem. And you're going to have to go see a doctor and that kind of thing. And so you're not going to be able to fly until we get your clearance on it. That's the threat.
Okay.
And I can imagine, I mean, one person that did come forward, I can't remember his name now, but he was interviewed, I think, on Lieutenant Graves. He now has his own podcast. Was saying that he couldn't say who it is that he flies for now. Some billionaire, he's a private pilot. But even with something like that, he's been told, you are not to say, you can talk about these things, but you are not to say that you fly for us. They see it as some kind of stigma, or that people would say, hey, if you've got a pilot who sees this kind of crazy stuff, maybe he's on drugs, I'm not going to fly with you. And so those are their concerns.
Okay. So people might be concerned that there's an issue with the pilot, and for that reason, it's bad for business.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. All right. That helps make sense of it. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Major David Grusch. You mentioned him earlier. He was at the hearing, the congressional hearing, and he had his News Nation interview that you briefly mentioned earlier, and it was kind of a bombshell. Can you maybe just briefly cover what he went over there?
Yes. Again, really high-ranking intelligence official, with all kinds of other folks affirming, yes, he is who he said he is, and he's utter man of utter integrity. He said that because once he was tasked to work with the UAP force, task force, to investigate these things, and he was not like a UFO believer before this, he was a skeptic, that he did his job. And when he did, that more than 40 witnesses came forward to him within his work and said, yes, I am in such a retrieval and reverse engineering program, probably most of them with private industry. They couldn't name at that point. I am, and I can show you documents and information, and I will testify to that. Now, once he got enough of that to really convince him something's going on, over 40 people, I would think some who didn't even know each other, then that's when he did the right thing. He brought it to the Inspector General. He brought it to his folks over him and with him, and right away they wanted to shut it down. So he, knowing that it probably involved illegal maneuvering where Congress is supposed to have oversight, did not, brought it to the Inspector General of the intelligence community, which he was a part of. Right thing to do. And then when he saw the evidence, he not only looked at Grusch's evidence, but he interviewed at least some of the people that Grusch had said can be interviewed and have this information. He was convinced that it was credible and urgent and took it to Congress. So then Congress, apparently for a couple of years, has been getting some of this kind of evidence. But for the first time, Grusch had it publicly under oath before Congress for the world to hear. You want to review kind of his major claims or allegations?
Yeah, some of the big claims that he made in that interview.
Yeah, that we have been having these things happen, unexplainable, since at least Roswell, and he even said the 30s, all the way back to the 30s, and that's kind of an interesting case we might want to talk about because it involves the Vatican, potentially involves the Vatican.
I was going to get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, okay, and that there has been a coordinated cover-up of it by the government, a disinformation program by DoD and the intelligence community, and that part of what they have done for decades, seeming to suggest all the way back to Roswell, is that they have actually recovered some craft or pieces of craft, crashed. When asked, okay, so these are all crashed, he said, well, we just recovered them. Anyway, he seemed to suggest that there were some that weren't actually crashed. So you have to ask, were they just landed and left here? Were they landed and the occupants were still in them? He gets into that later. That those things then have been tucked away, most of them, perhaps all of them, given over into the keeping of private aerospace and defense contractors, and to work on reverse engineering. That all that's happened. That we have recovered not only craft but alien bodies for the pilots. That's pretty wild. I mean, but again, we've heard this for 70 years now, and he, claims that there were crimes committed in the cover-up process. He also talked about, he couldn't go into detail because it's a case still going in certain circles that are being examined, but that he was being retaliated against. They were doing retribution against him. That he can give the names and contact information of these witnesses who are willing to go into the confidential settings where they have protection by the government law. And so basically, I mean, what he did is threw the ball into Congress's court because he's still bound by his non-disclosure agreements. He can only work within the parameters that are set by the folks who had to allow him to say what he did. But he can say all the rest as long as he is talking to people who also have the clearance that they need. And he said, I'll give you, for the retrieval programs and work projects, I'll give you names, I'll give you places, locations, names of the projects, names of the people involved. So it's not like he has some kind of hearsay stuff or something. He's got specifics.
So he has all that information. He is presumably at liberty to disclose it in a private setting with the people with the proper credentials, presumably the individuals that he was speaking to in Congress. So why not go ahead and meet with him, give him all that information, and Congress goes after him?
Well, he may be doing that. But like I said, there's some talk. Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee, God bless him, has been very, he's been really pushing hard against all kinds of pushback for transparency in this. And he talked about how some of the pushback he was getting, even in Congress, to try to get these hearings set up, he wanted to insist that they be under oath. People were pushing back against that because if they're opponents of all this and they can claim, well, he could have lied, he's not under oath. But they finally did get it arranged so they could be under oath. Even trying to make it so they had a hard time finding a room for the hearing. And at first, the one they had was a junky old one, small from what I heard, and he had to get a bigger one that was more appropriate for that. And by the way, the interest in this, there were people who, the public that wanted to get in on the hearing. There were some seats for them. They stretched out all the way down the hall, hundreds of them, and then apparently I heard 1,000 outside that never could even get in the building. Some of them started camping out at 3 a.m. the morning before so they could get in. And staff members were saying, congressional staff, we've never seen anything like this in terms of interest. And I think that's probably right.
Oh, yeah. But I guess so the difficulty is, I mean, you got Grusch who can give them names, dates, places, and all that, and presumably has or will. But they're running up against brick wall whenever they try to go and investigate this. Is that right?
Yeah, and so you've got, he had some examples. He couldn't give names, but of staff or other people's, saying things that made it clear that someone had leaned on them in one way or another, and whether they were leaning on them through some kind of blackmail or threat to withdraw campaign funds, or I wouldn't even be surprised if we're talking about the intelligence community. They're very good at digging up dirt on people. I would even say maybe manufacturing dirt on people. They could be leaning on people that way, but trying to, all it would take would be a call from a major donor. Someone's giving you $500,000, and that's happened with some of the congressmen, and say, this Grusch guy, I really don't think you should be giving any attention to him. I'm not saying they do, but it's certainly possible. We've seen it happen in other situations.
You mentioned crashings earlier, and I'm curious. And it was brought up during Congress, and I don't know if there was really a sufficient answer. If there was, I missed it. But the question is, why is, if aliens are real and they have this technology to reach us, why do they continue to crash? What's going on there?
First of all, the simple answer is look how sophisticated our technology is, and we have jets crash. We have the most advanced things we have, craft of different kinds. They also crash sometimes. You're not, just because even if you're 100,000 years advanced in technology ahead of us, doesn't mean you're infallible. You can't have problems. The other things that, there have been some suggestions that, for instance, in one of the claimed crashes, that there were experimental things going on with electromagnetic radiation being sent up right in the path of where the thing came through. Now that could just be wild speculation, but I don't think it's too much of a reach to say there might, if we had things like that, there might even be ways in which, even if we didn't realize we could bring something down if it's a kind of anti-gravitic propulsion system that somehow relies on extreme electromagnetic radiation. I don't know, but I'm just saying, even aside from that, even the most advanced kind of technology that we have, it has flaws. It's not perfect. They're not gods. They're if they're around, they're beings that God created and have their own limitations.
Well, they indicate during the congressional hearing that some of these encounters with these beings have been negative in nature, and some have resulted in humans dying. Am I maybe misremembering and confusing that, or conflating?
No, Grusch did imply, I think, on at least one situation. What's happened is, what we have reports of, and I think there's evidence for, is that there are, first of all, some situations like Rindelsheim in England where people come, something lands, they get really close to it, and then they end up having all kinds of physical problems, almost like Havana syndrome or other kinds, things like that, but that seem to be traceable back to that encounter. Dr. Gary Nolan, I think he's probably a Nobel Prize candidate at this point. That's what you call a nominee. Well known all over the world in his field. He was actually brought stuff by the CIA, images of brains of people who had been affected by coming too close to these things, and the kind of anomalies that were going on inside their heads, and asked to examine that, study it, and give them some kind of reports. So you've got that kind of thing where it's not necessarily an intentional injury. It's just that whatever they've got, it would be like somebody unintentionally walking in front of one of our microwave things on a ship, and they would be fried. The other thing is that there have been reported incidents, and all this, of course, the government knows for sure, but where we went after them and even fired on them. So we know for sure there's some where they're engaged. We engaged, such as the ones over DC back in the 50s, but others where they're engaged with them. And if we fired on one of them, well, they just might fire back,
This was in DC in the 50s. I think you mentioned that earlier. Was there just visual perception of this? People saw this, and
radar, which is basically what we had back then. I don't think they had infrared.
But there were eyewitnesses.
Oh,
They were not part of the government that saw fighter pilots chasing around alien spacecraft
over DC. Yep. It's and the newspapers all reported it at the time. And yeah, he had a similar thing happen in Los Angeles a few years before that.
Wouldn't that have been enough to kind of settle? Okay, there are aliens. What
Not
am
the
I
way the
missing?
government handled it, where and after a while, then the press gets leaned on apparently, and they start saying, "Oh, there must be other explanations for this because they're under the influence of certain powers that have some kind of power over them."
What was the answer that they gave? People,
I don't even know, to be
yeah,
honest. I've read the few days
yeah.
around it where they're interviewing all the eyewitnesses and they're talking about the jets and
Mhm.
that kind of thing, but it is all well documented that they
Yeah.
were actual objects caught on radar, visually seen by many, and that we sent jets after them. And that's not the only time.
Yeah, right. And then you also had Roswell, right?
Yeah, I mean,
A little bit before
it's
then.
yeah. Roswell would have been what, 47.
Hmm.
So, but the flap in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken, was still during the war. And in fact, that was the fear at first. People thought that the Japanese had some kind of aerial attack going over the city.
Somebody earlier in the chat mentioned that right after Roswell, within just a few months, the CIA was formed.
Exactly, and the Air Force.
And
Before that, it was the Army Air, Air Corps. So within months after that, those two things were established. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That is pretty interesting. Did you also hear about this other one? I saw it the other day. There's this KGB report about some Russians who encountered aliens in a UFO, and the aliens end up firing on them and turning them into stone, per the KGB report. Have you heard of this before?
I haven't heard that one. Turn him into stone. I know what happened was with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then Russia's big change from the Soviet Union to something else. There was a window of opportunity for investigative journalists like George Knapp here in America, who was interested in this, to get into Russia and contact the people who would know, who were at that point free to talk about it. Actually took classified documents out of the country, brought them back to the U.S. And what we do know from those things is that just as it was in the United States, that our nuclear facilities have been visited, and apparently the things were able to manipulate from a distance our systems. So you may be familiar with that. So Malmstrom Air Force Base back in the would have been 70s, I guess 60s or 70s, 60s, I think. Big red hovering UFO hovers over the base. Everybody's seeing it, including the commander and the other people. And while it's there, one by one, all of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear, start shutting down, being taken offline. And then when it leaves, they all come back online. And in Russia, it was an even scarier scenario where the things were online, and then all of a sudden, one by one, they started being put in readiness to actually fire, and they couldn't do anything to stop it. And they were afraid there was going to be a third world war, that these things were going to get the missiles were going to be sent, and they hadn't done it themselves. And then once the UFO left, they went back to where they had been. And in either case, I think, have they been able to find what exactly happened that they could explain in a prosaic way.
Wow. Now, one of the other individuals that you mentioned also at the congressional hearing is Commander Fravor, which we know from the Tic-tac UFO. And so maybe talk a little bit about that and the video footage that we have there on the Tic-tac. What's your impression?
My impression is it's probably, in certain ways, one of the best documented occurrences of UFO or UAP that we have, because you have several different. First of all, you have eyewitnesses, but then you also have several different kinds of the most sophisticated sensory, machines that we have. What is it? Forward-looking infrared radar, some other things that they all converged. They all said, yes, there are things right there. They gave the same coordinates, and that's so people can't say it was just a mess up in one of the cameras or something. So you had all kinds of visual, you had all those things, and they all converge and say, yeah, it was there, and there were lots of them. The other thing that you get on, both of the oceans off the coast of, say, Jacksonville and Virginia, on the East Coast and the West Coast off the coast of California, is that these kinds of things are continue to be seen again and again. I think it was Ryan Graves, and testified that daily for years they were being reported. So you would think after a while, come on, guys, why? Surely this should have been published. Surely this is news. But it was kept quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is the Tic-tac video right here that we have pulled up on the screen. And evidently they have it from other angles as well that just hasn't been released, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the claim. And folks that said we saw more footage and it's not there. It was not, and what was, I guess you could say, leaked. It's a complicated process by the way it came out, but the government did finally say, yeah, that's legitimate footage.
Why reveal that whenever there seems to be a governmental conspiracy to cover this stuff up? Is it just people who are in the government that want this information to come out? They're not part of the cover up and they ended up smuggling this out, or like how did this happen?
What you have is folks like Lou Elizondo, who was at one point actually the head of the UAP force. They have different names for it. Who came out because they were not being transparent, and I just call him more of a witness than a whistleblower. He and then Chris Mellon in the Defense Department, Hype in the Defense Department, they made the arrangements for this to become public. Now, whether you call it leaking or smuggling, I don't think it's exactly that, because if so, I think they probably would have been prosecuted. But once it was out, it would have been very hard for the DoD to say this is fake. So it's exactly what you're talking about. What I mentioned a while ago. You've got folks like Lou and Chris who want to see transparency, and then you got other folks behind the scenes who are trying to prevent it.
Do we know who those folks are by name? Is that out there in the public or not yet?
The ones trying to prevent it, or the ones?
Yeah.
No, but what you can do, I mean, sometimes it's hard to say when a public figure makes a statement that is not true, or that is spoken in such a way that they're misleading the public, like by saying this particular agency, Arrow, has no credible evidence.
Yeah.
And actually, the rest of DoD and the CIA and the others, they have all kinds of evidence. So you'll know that those folks are a part of the continuing cover-up.
Okay.
But how much they actually know, I don't know. When General Milley the other day, made some of his comments, I just shaking my head saying, if that's all you know, then you've been kept out of the loop. But anyway, the only names we'd have at this point are the people who go public and say, "Oh no, this isn't true. This isn't true."
Those are the conspicuous ones.
Yep.
Now you mentioned George Knapp there, the journalist who broke the case with Bob Lazar, and I saw George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, who also works in conjunction with him, both sitting behind Grusch and Fravor. I noticed someone. I said, "Those faces look familiar." Oh yeah, I remember
the tattoos look real familiar.
Yeah,
unmistakable.
Yeah, and so I saw them there. I said, "Okay, well," because I was kind of wondering what their thoughts would have been on it. So I'm sure they have them since they were.
Oh, they've had a lot. Yeah, they've been saying a lot. In fact, they just came out. They have a podcast called Weaponized.
Yes,
and they've just come out with one. Episode 30 or 29 or something about the smear campaign on Grusch. So they have a lot to, you might want to check that out. But in a segment I was watching on that UFO podcast, which is a great one I recommend, all kinds of people on there, but Jeremy was Corbell was being interviewed and he was saying the reason they're behind him is that he and George, and I know this is true from earlier stuff, have been instrumental in working with David Grusch, even before the public interview and Ross Coulthard's thing. Had been working with him, keeping the information quiet because he wasn't comfortable with it being released yet, and then had encouraged him, tried to make connections with their connections in Congress to get him to be one of these, the people there. And that's why they were allowed to sit so close to him. But there was a man behind him, and I can't think of his name, but he is Grusch's lawyer. So that's why he was between Corbell and Knapp, and why he was sitting right behind him, because Corbell was saying at times Grusch would launch into something and the lawyer would sit forward and say, no further on that, or let's not go that direction, because he knows better than Grusch the legal implications of what he can say publicly and what he can't. So that's what those three people were sitting right behind him.
Yeah, I didn't know his lawyer was present. That's interesting. But I did notice that there was somebody in between them.
I thought the same thing. Well, I just saw Corbell on an interview last night, and he was explaining all of that.
Okay. I'm gonna have to check that out. Well, they broke I say they, George broke the story on Bob Lazar, and Jeremy came later on, I think, and did a documentary about Bob Lazar. But tell us a little bit about Bob Lazar, and do you think that his story is credible?
Oh golly, I haven't looked real closely at him because he's surrounded by so much controversy and
Yeah.
so many things that seem maybe a little sketchy that
Yeah.
I've tried to focus more on things that I think are more
Sure.
obviously credible. Corbell and Knapp that I really trust. They insist he's true. I think when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast,
Yeah.
some folks found it credible.
Oh, yeah.
I don't feel like I'm competent to make a judgment about that because there's just so many things that don't seem to add up. But you never know. For instance, well, just that, and then his credentials, and he was involved in some sketchy stuff afterward, legal problems, and that doesn't necessarily mean the story's not true, but it does seem to maybe question his credibility. And the fact that I even say this, people who are watching this that know the story, they're probably going to get angry at me, but I'm just saying, I don't know for sure, one way or the other. You ask, and so I'll tell you, I don't know for sure, but some of the things that Grusch is saying would certainly be compatible with some of the claims that Greer made. I'll say that much. Yeah.
Okay. Now you mentioned it earlier, and it was certainly a question that I wanted to ask you, and that is, Grusch said in his News Nation interview that the Vatican has known about aliens and recovered UFOs since 30s,
1933. Well, yes, the crash happened in 33. We don't know about the Vatican's, if this is a true story. The Vatican's involvement wasn't until like 44, something like that.
All right. So tell me about whether or not this is credible.
Okay. Oh my! Of course, my ears perked up when I heard him say that.
Yeah.
There have been folks claiming all along that the Vatican knows a lot and has thought it not that out of a matter of discretion and caution, which the Vatican is full of for understandable reasons, has not said anything for a while. The enemies of the Catholic Church that have said, well, that's because it's going to destroy your religion if you let us know what you know. That's why you're keeping it secret. I don't think that's the case at all. My whole book is about why I think that the existence of these things would not be contrary to Catholic faith. But so I wouldn't be surprised. They have a very efficient intelligence community themselves, the Vatican. They have worldwide contacts. It's a worldwide organization, 1.2 billion people or something belonging to the Catholic Church. So I wouldn't be surprised if they knew all kinds of things, had stuff in the archives, what used to be called the secret archives, but that only meant like the separate, secluded archives. But with regard to this in particular, so the claim is that in 1933, Mussolini, the fascist dictator, is in charge of Italy, that there was a crash near Milan, Italy. And what is the name of it? Magenta, Italy. And that he quickly gets his forces out. They recover it. They put it in either on a military base or some kind of warehouse or something in the Milan area. And then he holds on to it, or perhaps is trying to see about reverse engineering. Supposedly Marconi and some others, were brought in. But then when his government falls apart toward the end of World War II, and fascist government's falling apart and kind of chaos, then you've got a situation where, and I'm kind of reading between the lines here, where there would have been concern, if this is a true story, where there would have been great concern about who's gonna come into ownership of this thing. What if the Soviets should keep pressing down, pressing into Europe? What if somehow they get control of it and spirit it out? What if the Nazis, as a last effort, because they were definitely interested in this kind of thing, are able to obtain it, get it across the ocean to South America, where so many Nazis apparently went? What if they got a hold of it? What if even the mafia got a hold of it, and then we're going to sell it to the highest bidder or whatever? Those are kind of my thoughts. Others like Grusch haven't said that, but the Bear claim allegation is that at that point, Pope Pius XII became a mediator basically between the Italian government and the U.S. government, and helped arrange for the U.S. government to recover the crash material and bring it back to the United States. So all the rest is that all the rest has got my speculation, because when people say, why would the Pope do that? I say, well, if I put myself in that situation where the fascist government fell apart and you've got all these other forces coming in that desperately would want it, and I ask myself, who in the world would I trust it with? I'd probably say that the Americans, certainly not the Soviets, certainly not the Nazis, certainly not the mafia or others. So I could see why he might think that's a reasonable thing to do. Now, keeping it a secret, I can see reasons why he would think it's better for the secular governments, one of them, to reveal it first, if that's true. So then the question becomes, how credible is that? You have people who've done the research and say, well, I question the credibility because these claims were made by an anonymous source to Italian news media, I guess, that only decades later, and they had like what was supposed to be a secret Italian correspondence about it, and they just submitted anonymously some photocopies and some other stuff. So reasonably, I would say, okay, that in itself is not enough to convince me. I haven't heard of anyone yet who actually demonstrates it's a hoax, but simply that the evidence we have is not credible. So then that leaves you with, okay, is Dave Grusch just passing on flimsy evidence? And could be, but this guy's really dogged about investigating things.
Yeah.
I think there's at least a possibility. I can't judge at this point whether it's true or not. There's at least a possibility that in his position, high enough up with the intelligence community and the agency searching out these things, that he may have been able to get more convincing evidence than what was made public. Maybe he got the original of the correspondence. Maybe he had all kinds of other people come to him and say, this stuff is real. So I don't think it discredits Grusch in any way. I don't think it proves it either, but I still am open to the possibility that it could have happened and that Grusch actually has better evidence for it than has been made public before, which is, to me, not enough to convince everybody.
I think it may have been Jimmy Akin who countered this claim and said, well, you would think that the Vatican would be preparing us more for encounters with aliens if they actually knew about aliens. What do you say to that?
Well, it depends on what kind of preparation you're looking for. They're going to issue an encyclical of some kind. What you do get, though, is like Father Funes, who's the former director of the Vatican Observatory. A lot of people don't realize the Vatican actually has an astronomical observatory, centuries old. The Jesuits run it. It's been, and they also are affiliated with one in Arizona. And many of the Jesuit Catholic scientists there have been in the forefront of astronomy, and there are craters on the moon named for them, stuff like that, all the research they've done. But that, he, under his leadership, they actually held 2 different conferences on astrobiology, the possibility of life in other places. And in one of his, it was a news conference or a speech he made, but he said, it's not contrary to the Catholic faith. We don't want to put limits on God's creative power. And you've had, of course, Pope Francis, involved in some situation talking about baptizing an alien. I don't know what to make of that. But what a lot of folks don't realize is John Paul II, back in, during his pontificate, he had an audience at a parish in Rome. Details are in my book, but and people asking questions, and a young girl asked him, "Holy Father, what about aliens?" And if aliens were contrary to the faith, or he knew that somehow that it couldn't be, then you expect him to say, "Oh, that's contrary to the faith," or they don't exist. He didn't say that. He didn't say science will have to tell us. He didn't say we don't know. He didn't say, well, if they are, then. All he said was a really simple statement. He said, always remember, to the little girl, always remember, they're God's children too. That tells me a lot. And you've got some folks, some of my critics, and have said, oh, the catechism denies the existence of ETI. And I think in my book I've demonstrated that's a misreading. But who was the Pope that gave us that catechism? Who was the one that wrote the introduction and recommended it warmly, would have known it better than anyone else? Well, that's John Paul II. And if he knew that the catechism was denying the existence of ETI, and he believed that to be a part of the faith, I guarantee you he wouldn't have said that publicly to that little girl, oh, they're God's children too. He would have said something simple like, our faith teaches us they don't exist.
I want to get to some chat questions here in just a second, kind of wrapping it up. But y'all go ahead and put your questions there in the chat. Make sure to put them to at Reason and Theology. But I want to ask you very quickly some alternative explanations. Get your thoughts on them very, very briefly. Number one, could it be demons? aliens.
Yeah, you've got some people just say, absolutely, it's all demons.
Right.
And I get really tired of that pushback.
Yeah.
I am convinced that at least some of the abduction stories are almost certainly demonic. Even secular observers have noted the parallels between some of the abduction accounts and some classical accounts of demonic encounter. The fact that they're abducted, the fact that their uncomfortable things are done to them physically, sometimes involving sexual stuff, the fact that they are, especially on some occasions, will say something like, your religion's wrong, we're going to teach you the truth about it. We've heard that kind of stuff before. So I think that's probably the case, that some of them are, yeah. But you can't leap from that to saying hundreds of thousands of encounters that have been documented, that they're all demonic for that reason. There could also be other natural things. I like to compare it to what went on with the with epilepsy. So, for instance, in biblical times, if someone had a seizure, the assumption was always it's demons. It's demons. It's always demons if that happens. And finally, medical science helps us to see that actually some of the seizures come from a medical problem, epilepsy. Now, does that mean that the demons don't exist? No. But doesn't it mean that some things that look like demonic stuff are actually natural phenomena? That's just one small example. I think you can draw parallels to the discovery of the New World. There were people who said, no, there cannot be human beings on the other side of the world. And so when we discovered them, instead of saying, oh, I guess there are, some of them started saying, well, they're not really human. And that became an excuse for people to exploit them and say, you're subhuman, so I can use you like property to kill you, can enslave you, whatever. And the church had to come out and say, no, they're human, and we've got to evangelize. So I'm just saying, you can't make that leap to say it's all demonic. The great majority of cases don't fit a demonic profile at all. And I think I know a little bit about this. I've written a few books, Manual for Spiritual Warfare and Saints Who Battle Satan, and another book as well that I'm pretty familiar with that. And doesn't seem to be demonic for most of the stuff.
What about the possibility that this is another nation's technology that we're witnessing?
I think the folks like Fravor and Graves, giving testimony, but so many others who know technology pretty well, would say this isn't just next generation stuff. This is stuff that seems to defy the law of physics. You have some people who claim that, it's actually our stuff, but the way we got it is through the reverse engineering. So I suppose that's possible that some of it's that way. But we're talking about things that, come from space through air down into the water, come from space down to the surface of the water in a second, make right turns and all kinds of other things on a dime, go at speeds that any human operator would be jelly against the wall of the craft. They're under intelligent control. Apparently, some of them you can see that they have stealth technology. They do active response to our radar and other things to jam us when they're being observed. They do playful things like with Fravor, David Fravor. The thing actually kind of engaged him and was almost like playing a game with him. China doesn't have that. And the other thing is that the same kinds of things have been observed ever since Roswell, and some of the things since the Foo Fighters in World War II. We know for sure China didn't have anything back then, or Russia, or us. We weren't anywhere near something like that. So how do you explain decades and decades of the same kind of thing being observed and say somehow it's drones or that it's our adversaries? Nobody had it back then, and I don't think anybody has it now. I just don't see how. Unless it's reverse engineered.
Or just leaps and bounds ahead of us with technology, but there's no reason to believe that they are.
Yeah, unless they got it from recovered, UFOs. That's the only way I could see it, because
or could they have just figured out the science to this advanced degree, but just without anybody knowing? Seems pretty unlikely, though.
The other unlikely part of that is that if Russia had these capabilities, Ukraine wouldn't have even had to happen. They would just like Fravor said in the congressional hearing, these things could come from outer space, show up at a place, bomb, or do whatever they're going to do, and be back and gone with a few seconds. Do you really think if Russia had that, they'd be going through all the losses they are now, instead of just conquering Ukraine? Or China, if they had it, we'd be toast. They're not using it. That says to me that I don't know. It seems to be another piece of the evidence that it doesn't belong to our terrestrial adversaries.
Yeah. Now, what about the claim that this is all just a governmental psyop?
I'd say there's been a governmental psyop, but it's the cover up, not this coming forward. People trying to say, oh, it's just a distraction to turn away from Hunter Biden or from Trump's trial, that kind of thing. Well, if that's what it is, they're not doing a very good job of it, because all the headlines are about that stuff, and maybe down in the corner somewhere you get something about UFOs. That just doesn't seem likely to me, besides the fact that it's been going on, we know for sure, for 70-some years. You don't even have the same politicians in office, the same political parties, come and go. No, I don't think you'd have a psyops all that time. And then you have the people who've leaked, the whistleblowers all along.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, final question for you before I get to a few chat questions. Again, y'all can put them to @Reason and Theology. So, what do you think, if you had to speculate, what do you think is going to happen next from Congress? What do you think their next move is?
Wow. More hearings, I believe. I mean, you always have to have the caveat. Okay, there could be somebody so powerful behind the scenes that they are able to really lean hard on Congress, and Congress doesn't do its job. I think there will be more hearings next for the Senate. If they are able to actually follow up on it and do it, then I think it's eventually going to have to blow everything wide open. Now, it is possible that Congress investigates these things and discovers it all, and then agrees with the DOT and the CIA that, oh yeah, we can't tell the public this. I hope that wouldn't happen. Surely there would be some kind of leak with staff members or something. Mm-hmm. But I think we're probably slowly, on the road to disclosure, but there's powerful forces that don't want it to happen. Mm-hmm. So how long that might take, what kind of whistleblowers it might take, what kind of leaked video footage. But even then, you have folks that have already set themselves up to say, whatever the government says, I don't believe it. They can show me hardware. They can have something hovering over the White House, so it's just a hologram. They've made their position non-falsifiable. No matter what you do, they have a way to say it. It's all made up.
And to be clear, I think it's kind of obvious what your position is. But to be clear, your position is aliens are real. We have encountered aliens. We have their technology. There's reverse engineering programs, and there's just a cover-up on part of the government. Is that right?
Depends on what you mean by alien. If you mean extraterrestrial,
yes.
I would rather use a more general term, non-human intelligence.
Gotcha.
These things are real.
Yep.
They are intelligently controlled. They're not ours. There's been a government cover-up. Mm-hmm. I am personally convinced of that. So I could be proven wrong. Okay, I understand that. The reason I say non-human intelligence, and boy, this would open a whole new can of worms. You might want another interview about this. And I mentioned it in the appendix at the end of my book, is that there have been a lot of observers who say, this stuff really does seem to have been around a long time, not just back to the 40s, but earlier, and you get accounts in ancient documents of stuff that seem like it maybe.
Yes.
And other things like fairy folk, and mythological creatures among the Greeks, and even the whole poltergeist phenomenon. And people say, well, that's all pagan, that's not. But no, actually, St. Augustine and St. Jerome both believed that at least some of the Greek mythological figures were real figures that were not human, were not angels, intelligent, what we would call now ultra-terrestrials, other terrestrial intelligences, that they existed. St. Jerome gives an account of St. Anthony of the desert encountering first a centaur, then a satyr. And then at the end says, now in case for those of you who think these things don't exist, and then he gives this whole account from would have been about the time he was born, probably, of how one was captured and brought before the emperor and all this other stuff. So at the very, very least, both of those believed in that. You get folks like Ludovico Sinistrari writing about the year 1700, well-known exorcist in Italy, who writing about it says, yeah, we've got all the demonic stuff, and they respond as they should to the name of Jesus and the sacraments and the sacramentals and the rite of exorcism. But we're bumping up against other things out there that do not respond the way demonic powers are. And then he quotes Augustine and says, what if there are these things that are non-human, not demonic, not angelic, but some other kind of intelligence that's been around for a long time? And then that's picked up again in the 1900s by Father Herbert Thurston, who does a study of poltergeist cases in Europe that shows that, yes, a number of them were demonic. They responded as they should have to all the church weapons that the church had against them, but there were others that just were like naughty children trying to disturb, the ritual. I'm not saying that's for sure true. I'm just saying that you have a lot of folks who studied UFOs who are thinking maybe there's some of that too. It could be a bunch of things. It could be some of them demons, some of them from another planet, some of them of these other kinds of creatures that maybe that's one reason why so many of them seem to come out of the water and go down into the water. Sounds wild, but folks, one of the things I'm learning these days is you got to keep your mind open. It's not contrary to the faith that God created these other things. Padre Pio, I should mention too, Padre Pio, say it in my book. And that's been, people have come back at me with documentation. Well, I've got the documentation in 2 books in Italian, and where one of them was one of his spiritual sons, as he called them, and one was apparently his favorite spiritual daughter, and each of them independently report this, is saying that, of course, they're extraterrestrials, and some of them even give glory to God better than we do because they're not fallen. So all I'm saying is, at the very least, you can't say that it's that if you know the Catholic faith, that you got to know it's contrary to it. It's not. John Paul's going to know better than that. Padre Pio will know better than that. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich in her visions had visions of life out there, intelligent life out there. So we can't just be so smug and say, no, it's all demons. It doesn't work.
Yeah, you ever heard of the Apkallu?
Apkallu. Is that Native American?
No, these are from antiquity. So from back in Sumerian times, I think. Yeah, Sumerian and also Akkadian times. The Apkallu, or 7 sages. These are referenced by Berosus, 3rd century BC, who mentions from antiquity there's these 7 sages that would come out of, in some cases, come out of the water. In other cases, also come from other planets, and imparted all kinds of knowledge and wisdom to the human race. And there's a lot of stories about this. You ever heard of this before?
Well, not that particular one, but other cultures have the same thing, that we're given the arts by folks who come down or come from somewhere else. And I just emphasize in my book, we've got to have humility on this subject. We can't say that we've got it all figured out, and the church has certainly not given a definitive answer to any of these questions. I think the church is leaving it for science, or if they know something, they're waiting for the right time. But I like to talk about having a sense of wonder, and I define that by saying humility in the face of mystery. We've got a lot of mystery here, and God's, he said to Job, "Where were you? And I laid the foundations of the world, and I cast the Pleiades out there, and I did the ordinances of the heavens." You don't have a clue about any of that, and we don't. So let's be humble about it. Let's hold fast to our Catholic faith, what we do know, and don't try to put any restrictions on the creative power of God.
Fair enough. I bring up the Apkallu because there are some resemblances between them and the book of Genesis with the Nephilim. I bet you get that a lot, right?
Oh, God, yeah. All I can say, all right, I went to Yale as an undergrad. I was a religious studies major. And I took my Old Testament course with Judah Golden, who was, at that time, just one of the premier, I don't think you would call him a rabbi, but premier Jewish scholars in the Old Testament. And when we got to Genesis 6, and of course, one of the students had to say, "Professor, what's the Nephilim?" And, he was very straightforward about it. We don't know what the Nephilim. You got all kinds of speculation in Jewish literature, as you do in Christian literature, but nobody really knows. And so it seems so imprudent, I'll say, unwise, for people to be spinning these new myths based on the Book of Enoch, which is not part of the canon, and on speculations from Jewish writers and stuff that's how they're going to explain what UFOs are. I just it doesn't work for me.
I hear you. I gotcha. Here's a question for you. What's the end game? If aliens are proven to exist, what comes next?
For us or for them? That's my question. For them, say, okay, guys, if we figured you out, why don't you show yourselves now?
Right.
For us, and people have talked about this. You have folks who said there'll be a great ontological shock, as they call it. In other words, a shock in our very sense of who we are and our essence, our being. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that for a lot of people, it really will seem disturbing and unsettling. A lot of Christians will say, does this prove, or asked, does this disprove my faith? And there'll be non-Christians saying, see, it shows your faith is wrong. They've been doing that for centuries. You have people like Thomas Paine, who wrote the pamphlets during the American Revolution, and others who spent this whole time telling how he thought that he believed that ETI exists and that it would disprove the Christian religion, that kind of thing. I want him to know that, no, if you look at the history, which is most of what my book is, the history of the conversation about this in the Catholic and then eventually broader Christian tradition, they didn't see it as contrary. They saw it as an open question, especially once they realized there could be planets out there that are rocky bodies that could have inhabitants, up until we finally got out from under Aristotle's wrong cosmology that the Earth's the center and all that. They didn't even realize that other planets could exist. They thought the planets were wandering stars. That's where the name comes from. So we have to have humility, in the face of this mystery. And it's important to see that people have thought about this in the Christian community for a long time, and it didn't make them panic in the streets.
Can you say that Grusch's revelations are fake to distract from other political scandals? Plus, the fact he got permission shows they don't find revealing it a problem. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mentioned about the distraction. If it were distraction, they could really do that. You could have Millie or somebody else stand up there and say, okay, guys, this is real. And the next thing you know, probably the stuff about Trump and about Hunter Biden would go down to the bottom of the page. But how could it be a distraction? If it's a distraction, it's a very poor distraction, because all the headlines are occupied by the other stuff. And if they say anything about this at all, it's a tiny little footnote somewhere on the next page. Mm-hmm. So I don't think, I think if they wanted it to be a distraction, they wouldn't have done it this way. And it looks more like a soft or slow disclosure to me. And maybe just because they can't hold it back anymore. But what was the second part of the question? Help me
out. Plus the fact he got permission, shows they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, that says to me, probably again, that you've got these factions going on in the government itself, with some folks wanting to move toward transparency and others not. I suppose that could be a faking out move on the part of the government to let Grusch get out there. Excuse me, and then to come back and say, no, it's all lies. This guy's a fool, and so is anybody else who talked about him. I don't think that's going to happen, though.
Michael asks, so you mentioned earlier about defying physics. Isn't that saying constant numbers aren't constant?
Great question. If I said defy physics, I should have said defy physics as we know it.
Right.
And that's a big distinction.
Sure.
If you start reading, quantum theory, quantum physics, and you realize, oh my goodness, all the stuff we thought we knew about physics does not seem to hold. A lot of it does not seem to hold at the quantum level. So you've got things like, spooky, what is it? Spooky influence at a distance or something.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So with that kind of stuff, that makes me realize that, if you ever read Thomas Kuhn's book about scientific revolutions, how there'll be a paradigm shift from time to time in science, where all of a sudden Copernicus, that revolution was one. All of a sudden somebody's able to demonstrate something, and it changes almost everything in science. And, science is not infallible, and revolutions like that happen. And there's so much right now to call into question our models of physics and our laws of physics, at least at the quantum level, that I'm sorry if I said, defies the law of physics as we know it. Another 100 years, it may all make sense to us.
So why are alien apparitions so recent? If their technology is so advanced, it would make sense that they have been visiting Earth for centuries.
The evidence seems to be that they have been visiting Earth for centuries. You get, the ancient Romans, who was it? I can't remember. One of the historians wrote about a battle involving Roman forces, and that these things appeared in the sky flying around over them that looked like flying shields. And you get accounts from Japan, you get accounts from China, 16th century Germany of one thing where there seems to be a battle between forces in the sky.
Yeah.
I don't remember whether that was Gothenburg or where, but and then, even back in the 1800s here, you get accounts of space of they call them flying ships or airships going around. And then you've got the really ancient stuff where the kind of legendary things that we've talked about. So I think, yes, we're seeing more because we've got the information, that's what we're looking for, the technology to sense more. but it has been going on a long time. And so, and even from a long time ago, things just as amazing as they are now.
Any final thoughts that you wanted to offer, cover something that maybe we didn't get a chance to cover? Anything?
Yeah, just to say, to folks that have, I've been accused of leading people to hell by saying that I think it's, that it's ETI's existence would be compatible, even without saying that I believe for sure it's there. My book just saying if it is. To say, folks, take a deep breath. This kind of thing's happened in history before when we discovered the New World, when Copernicus showed that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. And the church has always been able to accommodate that. And the thing is, just as it was with Copernicus, even though you had church leaders say, no, it can't be true, we're the center of the universe, that was never the teaching of the church, the official teaching of the church. And it was not just the theologians, but it was the scientists and philosophers who all believed it because they were under the influence of Aristotle. As soon as Aristotle's model was proven to be wrong, then they started going, to think about this. And so the church didn't say, oh, no, you've just proven our doctrine wrong, that the earth is the center of the universe. They said, okay, well, that wasn't even part of the doctrine of the church anyway. Now let's explore it. We'll have Jesuit astronomers looking at all this stuff. When Galileo wanted to prove that Jupiter had moons, and some people would not even, they refused to even look in the telescope because he would show the evidence. He had to, as a scientist, he had to get other scientists of some sort to confirm what he had said. And who did he turn to? The Jesuit astronomers. And they did confirm. Yes, we looked, we saw it. Jupiter has moons. So the Catholic faith can accommodate this, these things. It's just discovering a wider scope to God's creative power and his wisdom. And we don't need to be afraid. I mean, okay, are some of those hostile things, whatever they are? They could be, but that's no different from our discovering folks in the New World and finding out that some of them are hostile and some are friendly. They're still, as John Paul said, God's children. They're still his creatures. They're perhaps, I hope, capable of redemption. So we don't need to have this kind of ontological panic where we say, oh, no, now we have no idea what the world is really like.
So tell us, again, put in a plug for your book and tell us where we can go to get it.
Okay, it is. I can even show it to you. Here it is. Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Catholic Faith.
Yeah.
Are we alone in the universe with God and the angels? It's published by Tan Books. So if you go to Tan Books, TANBOOKS.com, put in extraterrestrial in the search engine, you'll find it. It's on Amazon too, but that's not my preferred way for you to get it. I would hope your local Catholic bookstore has it too, and if so, I'd love for you to get it from them.
Absolutely. Any other things that you wanted to put in a plug for? Anything else that you're maybe working on right now?
Well, my most recent book, this was the second to the last book number 60, is called The Life of St. Joseph as Seen by the Mystics. And it's I've woven together narratives, a handful of mystics with private revelations. And I make the point that you don't take them as gospel. That would tell us about the life of Joseph that we, details that aren't in the gospel. So I see it more as sacred drama. You can't say it's history because the mystics themselves don't agree on all the details. But I think it's some beautiful stuff that helps us to appreciate what kind of man it would be that God would entrust his son to be his guardian. So St. Joseph is worth getting to know better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Thigpen, for coming on and enlightening us on this topic. I really appreciate you and your time.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure. And God bless you and all your viewers.
Thank you. It was an honor to have you. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. Also, check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support the channel. God bless.